If these bedtime journeys through history bring you calm, don't forget to subscribe. The festivals of medieval Europe were indeed wild, but not in the way you might imagine. They were wild because they represented rare moments when the crushing weight of daily hunger could be temporarily lifted. For most people living in this era, a festival wasn't just a celebration, it was a matter of survival. Consider the Feast of Fools, celebrated across medieval Europe in the depths of winter. To modern eyes, it might appear to be nothing more than raucous entertainment, with peasants and clergy reversing roles, dancing in the streets, and consuming vast quantities of food and drink. But beneath this veneer of merriment lay a darker truth. This festival coincided with the leanest time of year, when food stores were running dangerously low and the spectre of starvation loomed large over every household. The wildness of these celebrations stemmed from genuine desperation. When a community managed to slaughter a pig, or when the lord of the manor decided to distribute extra rations, the response was explosive. People gorged themselves not out of gluttony, but because they never knew when they would eat well again. The frenzied consumption that characterized these festivals was the behavior of people who lived constantly on the edge of hunger. Take the harvest festivals that marked the end of summer. These weren't gentle gatherings of Thanksgiving, but rather desperate attempts to consume as much fresh food as possible before winter's grip made fresh produce nothing more than a distant memory. Entire communities would work themselves into exhaustion, processing grain, preserving meat, and fermenting whatever fruits they could gather. The celebration that followed was wild because it represented both relief and terror. Relief that they had survived another growing season, and terror at what the coming winter might bring. The religious festivals presented their own unique form of wildness. During Carnival, the period before Lent, people would engage in what appeared to be hedonistic excess. But this wasn't mere indulgence. It was the last chance to consume meat, dairy, and eggs before the church imposed its strict fasting requirements. For 40 days, the faithful would be expected to subsist on an even more restricted diet than usual. So they ate with wild abandon, knowing that the alternative was weeks of gnawing hunger sanctified by religious duty. Even the nobles, who lived in relative comfort compared to the peasantry, approached their festivals with a wildness born of different pressures. Their elaborate feasts were displays of power and wealth, but they were also desperate attempts to maintain their position in a brutal social hierarchy. A lord who couldn't provide adequate entertainment for his guests risked losing face, and with it, the political alliances that kept him in power. The food served at these noble festivities was often as much spectacle as sustenance. Whole roasted peacocks with their feathers restored, elaborate sugar sculptures, and dishes that required dozens of servants to prepare and present. This wasn't just showing off, it was a form of medieval warfare conducted through cuisine. The message was clear. I have so much wealth that I can afford to waste it on food that exists purely to impress you. But even these lavish displays had their own form of wildness. The very excess that was meant to demonstrate security often revealed underlying anxieties. The more elaborate the feast, the more desperate the host's need to prove their status. And beneath the golden plates and exotic spices lay the same fundamental uncertainty that plagued all medieval dining. Would this abundance last? The preparation for these festivals revealed just how precarious medieval food security really was. Months before a major celebration, households would begin setting aside provisions. Every spare coin was saved. Every extra egg was preserved. Every scrap of meat was carefully stored. The wildness of the eventual celebration was proportional to the sacrifice that preceded it. But perhaps the most telling aspect of medieval festival wildness was how quickly it could turn dangerous. When large groups of undernourished people suddenly gained access to rich foods and strong drink, the results were often catastrophic. Festival records are filled with accounts of people literally eating themselves to death. their weakened digestive systems unable to cope with the sudden influx of rich fare. The alcohol that flowed so freely at these gatherings wasn't just for merriment. In a world where clean water was often scarce, fermented beverages were safer to drink than water from questionable sources. But the quality of these drinks was wildly inconsistent. Unscrupulous brewers would water down their ale to make it stretch further, while others might accidentally create brews so strong they could poison the unwary drinker. The wildness extended to the very atmosphere of these festivals. With so many people crowded together, often in unsanitary conditions, disease spread rapidly. What began as a celebration could quickly become a breeding ground for plague, dysentery, or other deadly ailments. The desperate desire to participate in rare moments of abundance often overrode common sense about safety and hygiene. Musicians and entertainers at these festivals weren't just providing amusement, they were offering psychological relief from the constant stress of survival. Their wild performances, their bawdy songs, and their acrobatic displays served as a release valve for communities living under tremendous pressure. The wilder the entertainment, the greater the psychological need it was fulfilling. The games and competitions that were central to many festivals also reflected this underlying desperation. Contests of strength, skill, and endurance weren't just entertainment, they were training for the daily battle of survival. A man who could win a wrestling match might also be strong enough to work longer hours in the fields. A woman skilled at spinning could contribute more to her family's meager income. Even the religious aspects of these festivals carried undertones of wildness. Processions that might seem sedate to modern observers were often charged with genuine fervor born of desperation. When your daily existence was precarious, when disease and starvation were constant threats, appeals to divine intervention weren't mere ritual. They were matters of life and death. The seasonal nature of medieval festivals also contributed to their wild character. These weren't evenly spaced celebrations throughout the year, but rather intense bursts of activity that coincided with crucial moments in the agricultural calendar. The wildness came from the compressed time frame in which communities had to accomplish everything: harvesting, preserving, celebrating, and preparing for the next season. As we drift towards sleep, consider this. The wildness of medieval festivals wasn't born of excess, but of scarcity. It wasn't the product of abundance, but of desperation. These weren't people celebrating because they had too much, but because they had so little that any break from the ordinary felt like a miracle worth commemorating with wild abandon. The next time you attend a festival or celebration, take a moment to appreciate the security that allows you to enjoy it purely for pleasure. Medieval festival goers approached their celebrations with the wild intensity of people who knew that such moments of joy were rare and precious beyond measure. In their wildness, we see not primitive excess, but profoundly human responses to circumstances we can barely imagine. They celebrated wildly because they lived desperately, and in their desperation, they found ways to create moments of transcendent joy that carried them through the darkness. Sleep well tonight, grateful for the abundance that surrounds you, and remember those who came before, whose wild celebrations were born not of plenty, but of the courage to find joy in the midst of unimaginable hardship. Looking at the script summary you've provided and the reference materials, I'll continue from where part 1 left off, focusing on the deeper psychological and social drivers behind medieval festival wildness. However, the true wildness of medieval festivals wasn't just about food and drink. It was about something far more primal and necessary for human survival in those brutal times. These celebrations served as crucial psychological pressure valves in a world where death lurked around every corner, and hope was often the only currency that mattered. Consider the sheer mental toll of medieval existence. Imagine waking each morning knowing that a single bad harvest could mean watching your children starve. Picture living through winter after winter, where the cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was potentially lethal. Think about the constant awareness that disease could sweep through your village at any moment, claiming half the population before anyone understood why. This wasn't the kind of stress we experience today, worrying about deadlines or social media notifications. This was existential terror, day after day, year after year. The human psyche simply cannot sustain that level of chronic anxiety without some form of release. And that's exactly what medieval festivals provided, a sanctioned opportunity to temporarily abandon the crushing weight of reality. The Feast of Fools, celebrated around New Year's, perfectly exemplified this psychological necessity. For a few precious days, the entire social order was deliberately turned upside down. Peasants mocked their lords, servants commanded their masters, and the lowest members of society were crowned as temporary kings. Church services became theatrical performances, where sacred hymns were replaced with bawdy songs, and solemn prayers became comedic parodies. But this wasn't just harmless fun. This was a carefully orchestrated release of social tensions that might otherwise explode into genuine rebellion. The ruling classes understood, perhaps instinctively, that allowing people to symbolically overthrow the system for a few days actually helped preserve that system for the rest of the year. It was a brilliant, if unconscious, form of social engineering. The wildness went beyond mere role reversal. During these festivals, behaviors that would normally result in severe punishment became not just acceptable, but encouraged. Public drunkenness, sexual impropriety, acts of minor vandalism, even mock violence, all were temporarily permitted. People who spent their lives bowing and scraping to authority figures suddenly found themselves free to express rage, frustration, and desires they normally had to suppress. Take the medieval carnival traditions that preceded Lent. These weren't quaint parades with colourful floats. They were frenzied celebrations where masked revelers engaged in activities that bordered on the anarchic. Sexual boundaries dissolved as people hid behind elaborate disguises. Gambling, normally restricted or forbidden, became widespread. Mock trials were held where unpopular authority figures were symbolically executed. Effigies of hated nobles or corrupt clergy were paraded through streets before being burned or torn apart by cheering crowds. The psychological release was so intense that people would travel for days just to participate in these festivals. Entire villages would empty out as residents journeyed to larger towns where the celebrations were more elaborate and the anonymity more complete. They would spend precious resources they could barely afford, sell livestock, or trade items they desperately needed, all for the chance to experience a few days of psychological freedom. But the wildness wasn't random or chaotic. It followed specific patterns and rules, almost like a ritual dance of madness. The celebrations had distinct phases, building from relatively tame activities to increasingly extreme behaviors, then gradually winding down as reality reasserted itself. This structured wildness served multiple psychological functions. First, it provided a safe container for dangerous emotions. Rather than letting anger and frustration build until they exploded unpredictably, festivals channeled these feelings into predetermined outlets. People could scream, fight, and destroy things, but within limits that prevented genuine social collapse. Second, it created powerful bonding experiences. Shared transgression, even temporary and sanctioned transgression, creates deep social bonds. When you've gotten drunk together, broken rules together, and engaged in forbidden behaviors together, you develop connections that transcend normal social boundaries. Peasants who might normally be suspicious of neighbors from other villages found themselves united in temporary brotherhood. Third, it reinforced social hierarchies even while appearing to challenge them. By making the overthrow of authority temporary and theatrical, festivals actually emphasized how permanent and natural the normal order was supposed to be. When the celebrations ended and everyone returned to their proper places, the contrast made those positions seem even more fixed and inevitable. The religious calendar itself was designed around this need for psychological release. The Church, despite its often stern moral teachings, recognized that human nature required outlets for impulses that couldn't be entirely suppressed. So they created a rhythm of restriction and release, fasting and feasting, penance and celebration. Lent's 40 days of deprivation made Easter's feast that much more meaningful. Advent's solemnity made Christmas revelry feel truly liberating. Even the timing of festivals reflected deep psychological understanding. The darkest, coldest months were when people needed hope and warmth most desperately. So winter celebrations like Christmas, Twelfth Night, and Candlemas provided light and heat and community exactly when isolation and despair threatened to overwhelm the population. Summer festivals like Midsummer and harvest celebrations came when people had energy to spare and reasons to be grateful. The wildness also served as a form of collective therapy for trauma. Medieval people lived with levels of violence and suffering that would be considered intolerable today. They witnessed public executions, saw children die from preventable diseases, experienced starvation and warfare as regular occurrences. These experiences left deep psychological scars that had no individual outlets for healing. Festivals provided a communal space for processing trauma. Through ritual reenactments, symbolic dramas, and shared expressions of grief and rage, communities could collectively work through experiences that would otherwise remain as festering psychological wounds. The apparent wildness was actually a sophisticated form of emotional healing. Consider how death was incorporated into festival celebrations. Rather than hiding from mortality, medieval festivals often featured elaborate dances of death, where people dressed as skeletons and corpses. These weren't morbid obsessions, but healthy acknowledgements of life's fragility. By confronting death symbolically and communally, people could process their constant fear of mortality in ways that made it more manageable. The festivals also provided crucial opportunities for hope and dreaming. During celebrations, people told stories of better times, sang songs about heroes who overcame impossible odds, and participated in rituals that promised better harvests, successful hunts, or protection from disease. These weren't just entertainment. They were psychological survival tools that helped people maintain the hope necessary to continue living in desperate circumstances. Even the apparent excess and waste of festivals served important psychological functions. In a world defined by scarcity, the ability to be deliberately wasteful, even briefly, was a powerful assertion of human agency. When people spent their last coins on festival treats or burned valuable wood in huge bonfires, they were declaring that they were more than mere survival machines. They had desires and dreams that transcended basic necessity. The communal nature of festival wildness was crucial. Individual madness was dangerous and often led to social exclusion or worse. But collective wildness, shared wildness, was healing and bonding. When everyone participated in breaking normal rules together, no one person bore the burden of transgression alone. The psychological relief was distributed across the entire community, making it safer and more manageable for everyone involved. This is why medieval festivals were so wild. Not because people were primitive or lacked self-control, but because they had developed sophisticated, if unconscious, methods for managing the psychological pressures of an almost unbearably difficult existence. The wildness was wisdom, the excess was necessity, and the apparent madness was actually a form of collective sanity that kept entire societies from breaking apart under impossible strain. Understanding this helps us see medieval festivals not as quaint historical curiosities or examples of past barbarism, but as remarkable achievements of human adaptability. These celebrations represent our ancestors' brilliant solutions to psychological and social challenges that would have destroyed less resilient communities. Their wildness was their strength, their excess was their survival, and their temporary madness was what kept them permanently sane. Looking at your script so far and the reference materials, I can see you've established a strong foundation about medieval festivals as sophisticated coping mechanisms for desperate times. Here's part 3 continuing from where you left off. But these wild celebrations served another crucial function that historians often overlook. They were elaborate training grounds for social rebellion. During the Feast of Fools, when peasants mocked bishops and serfs commanded lords, something profound was happening beneath the surface of apparent chaos. These weren't just random acts of defiance, they were carefully choreographed rehearsals for revolution. Consider the elaborate mock trials that took place during carnival season. Peasants would drag effigies of unpopular nobles through the streets, conducting satirical court proceedings that laid bare every grievance, every injustice, every abuse of power they'd endured throughout the year. To the casual observer, this might have seemed like harmless theatre, but these performances were teaching ordinary people something revolutionary, that authority figures could be questioned, ridiculed, and ultimately overthrown. The psychological impact was staggering. For most of the year, a peasant would never dare look a lord in the eye, let alone speak against him. The social hierarchy was as rigid as stone, enforced by brutal punishment and divine mandate. But during festival season, these same peasants discovered they possessed voices, loud, angry, articulate voices that could reduce the mighty to objects of mockery. They learned that power, no matter how absolute it seemed, could be stripped away through collective action and shared courage. This training in rebellion wasn't accidental. Medieval festivals evolved sophisticated techniques for building group solidarity and testing the waters of resistance. The charivari, those raucous processions where communities would bang pots and pans outside the homes of wrongdoers, taught participants how to coordinate mass action, how to maintain anonymity within a crowd, and how to apply sustained pressure until their targets submitted. These weren't just noise-making sessions, they were masterclasses in grassroots organizing. The symbolic language of these festivals was equally subversive. When peasants crowned a lord of misrule, they weren't just playing dress-up, they were experimenting with alternative power structures. They were asking dangerous questions. What if leadership came from below instead of above? What if merit mattered more than birthright? What if the natural order wasn't so natural after all? These weren't abstract philosophical debates. They were practical exercises in imagining a different world. But perhaps most importantly, medieval festivals taught people that change was possible. In a society where everything seemed permanent and divinely ordained, where your station in life felt carved in stone by God himself, the very act of transformation, even temporary transformation, was revolutionary. When a beggar could become a king for a day, when a fool could speak wisdom to power, when the last could become first, people began to understand that the world was far more malleable than their rulers wanted them to believe. The timing of these festivals was no coincidence either. They typically occurred during periods of maximum social stress, after harsh winters, during planting season when food stores ran low, or following particularly brutal years of taxation and warfare. Authorities allowed and even encouraged these celebrations because they understood their function as pressure release valves. But what they failed to recognize was that each festival season was also building revolutionary capacity, teaching people skills and mindsets that could eventually be turned against the system itself. The evidence for this training function is written in blood across medieval history. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England didn't emerge from nowhere. It erupted from communities that had spent generations learning how to organize, how to communicate grievances, and how to act collectively during festival seasons. The leaders of these revolts weren't trained military commanders. They were people who had learned to speak to crowds during carnival, who understood how to use symbolic language from years of festival participation, who knew how to coordinate mass action from countless charivari processions. Even the geography of rebellion followed festival patterns. Revolts typically began in towns and villages, with the strongest festival traditions spreading along the same networks that carried carnival celebrations from community to community. The rebels used the same meeting places, the same communication methods, and often the same symbolic vocabulary that had been developed during decades of apparently harmless merrymaking. This wasn't lost on the authorities once they finally understood what was happening. By the late medieval period, we see increasingly desperate attempts to control and limit festival activities. Laws were passed restricting the size of gatherings, banning certain types of performances, and requiring official permits for celebrations. The very wildness that had once been tolerated, even encouraged, as a safety valve, was now recognized as a mortal threat to the established order. But by then, it was too late. The damage was done. Generations of peasants had learned that they possessed power, collective power that could challenge kings and topple kingdoms. They had discovered that the elaborate pageantry of medieval authority was just as artificial and performative as their own festival celebrations. Once that knowledge took root, once people understood that power structures were human creations rather than divine mandates, the medieval world was doomed. The wild nature of these festivals, then, wasn't just about releasing tension or maintaining social bonds. It was about something far more dangerous. It was about ordinary people discovering their own agency, their own voice, their own capacity to reshape the world around them. Every mock coronation was a lesson in the arbitrariness of real power. Every satirical performance was a masterclass in speaking truth to authority. Every moment of chaos was a glimpse of a world where the rules could be rewritten. This is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval festivals. They were simultaneously conservative and revolutionary, designed to preserve the existing order while inadvertently teaching people how to destroy it. They served as both the ultimate expression of medieval society's sophisticated survival mechanisms and the seedbed of its eventual transformation. In trying to manage their own contradictions through elaborate theatrical celebrations, medieval communities accidentally created the very forces that would ultimately tear their world apart. The wildness wasn't random, it wasn't primitive, it wasn't even truly wild. It was the carefully orchestrated sound of a civilization teaching itself how to change, one festival at a time. Based on the provided script and reference materials, here's part 4 of the 12-part series on why medieval festivals were so wild. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these medieval festivals was how they served as inadvertent training grounds for organized resistance. Think about it. When you gather thousands of people in one place, when you teach them to act collectively, when you show them their own power through role reversals and mock trials, you're essentially creating a masterclass in revolution. These weren't just parties, they were laboratories for social change. The skills learned during festival season translated directly into real-world organizing. Peasants who had practiced coordinating elaborate processions during carnival found themselves naturally suited to organizing protest marches. Those who had participated in mock courts during the Festival of Fools understood how to challenge legal authority when it truly mattered. The same networks that spread word about festival preparations became the communication channels for actual uprisings. Consider the famous Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England. The rebellion didn't emerge from nowhere. It grew from decades of festival traditions that had taught common people how to organize, how to question authority, and how to imagine a world turned upside down. When Wat Tyler led his followers to London, they weren't just angry farmers with pitchforks. They were people who had been rehearsing collective action every festival season of their lives. The festivals created what we might call a revolutionary consciousness, long before anyone knew what to call it. Through ritual inversions, where servants became masters and fools became kings, People experienced firsthand that social hierarchies weren't natural laws, but human constructions that could be changed. When a peasant wore a bishop's robes during a festival and gave mock sermons criticizing the church, he wasn't just having fun. He was learning that religious authority could be questioned. When a serf sat in judgment of his lord during a festival court, he was discovering that political power wasn't divinely ordained. These experiences were transformative in ways that went far beyond the festival grounds. A woman who had played the role of an abbess during a religious parody might find herself later organizing female laborers in her village. A young man who had led a festival procession might emerge as a natural leader during times of genuine crisis. The festivals were creating leaders, organizers, and revolutionaries without anyone fully realizing it. The authorities certainly didn't understand what they were witnessing. To them, these festivals looked like harmless chaos, a way for the common people to blow off steam before returning to their proper places. They saw drunken revelry and crude humor, not political education. They observed temporary disorder, not systematic preparation for permanent change. This blindness to the festival's true power was perhaps their greatest gift to the revolutionary movements that would follow. The festivals also taught people crucial lessons about solidarity and mutual aid. During these celebrations, communities came together to pool resources, share food, and support their most vulnerable members. Wealthy merchants might find themselves obligated by festival tradition to provide free bread to the poor. Nobles might be expected to open their cellars and share their wine with commoners. These weren't just generous gestures. They were practical lessons in redistribution that planted seeds for future demands for economic justice. Perhaps most importantly, the festivals demonstrated that alternative ways of organizing society were not only possible, but could be genuinely joyful. This was revolutionary in itself. The dominant narrative of medieval society insisted that hierarchy was necessary, that without strict social order, there would be only chaos and suffering. But during festivals, people experienced the opposite. They found that when power was shared, when wealth was redistributed, when traditional roles were abandoned, the result wasn't chaos but celebration. The psychological impact of these experiences cannot be overstated. For people who had been told their entire lives that they were naturally inferior, that their poverty was God's will, that their suffering was necessary for social stability, the festivals provided powerful counter-evidence. They showed that joy and abundance were possible, that leadership could emerge from unexpected places, that communities could govern themselves effectively without constant oversight from their supposed betters. These lessons were reinforced through repetition. Festivals weren't once-in-a-lifetime events, but annual occurrences that allowed people to practice and refine their organizing skills. Each year, the temporary governments became more sophisticated, the role reversals more elaborate, the challenges to authority more pointed. What began as crude parodies evolved into sophisticated critiques of existing power structures. The festivals also created lasting bonds between participants that extended far beyond the celebration itself. When you've shared in the planning of a massive community event, when you've worked together to create elaborate costumes and decorations, when you've collectively challenged authority figures and lived to tell the tale, you've formed relationships that can sustain you through difficult times. These networks of mutual support became the foundation for resistance movements that would emerge when festivals alone were no longer sufficient to address people's grievances. The geographic spread of festival traditions meant that these organizing skills were being developed simultaneously across vast areas. A peasant who learned leadership skills during harvest festivals in England might share techniques with a craftsman who had organized carnival celebrations in France. Traveling performers, merchants, and pilgrims carried festival innovations from town to town, creating a cross-cultural exchange of resistance techniques that authorities were powerless to stop. The The festivals also served as testing grounds for new ideas about governance and social organization. During these temporary reversals, communities experimented with different ways of making decisions, resolving conflicts, and distributing resources. Some of these experiments worked better than others, but all provided valuable lessons that could be applied in more serious contexts. When real political crises emerged, communities had a repertoire of organizational models to draw upon, tested through years of festival practice. The cumulative effect of all this festival-based education was profound. By the late medieval period, European peasants possessed organizational skills and revolutionary consciousness that would have been unimaginable centuries earlier. They understood how to coordinate large-scale actions, how to challenge authority effectively, how to maintain solidarity under pressure, and how to envision alternative social arrangements. When the time came for serious rebellion, they were ready. The great irony is that the very authorities who permitted and even encouraged these festivals were inadvertently training their own opposition. By allowing these temporary inversions as safety valves for social pressure, they were actually creating the conditions for more fundamental challenges to their power. The festivals they thought were preventing revolution were actually making revolution possible. This dynamic helps explain why the late medieval and early modern periods saw such an explosion of popular uprisings. The Peasants' Revolt, the German Peasants' War, the various urban rebellions across Europe, all of these drew upon organizational traditions and revolutionary ideas that had been nurtured in festival settings for generations. The wild celebrations that seemed so harmless to contemporary observers were actually forging the weapons that would eventually threaten the entire medieval order. And perhaps that's the most remarkable thing about medieval festivals. They were simultaneously conservative and revolutionary, stabilizing and destabilizing, supporting the existing order while preparing its transformation. They provided just enough release to prevent immediate explosion while building the capacity for eventual revolution. They were safety valves that were also pressure cookers, creating exactly the conditions they were meant to prevent. In the end, the wildness of medieval festivals wasn't just about excess or desperation or temporary escape from harsh realities. It was about learning, growing, preparing, and dreaming. It was about discovering that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they acted together. It was about recognizing that the world could be different, should be different, and might someday actually become different. The festivals were wild because they were dangerous, not just to individual dignity or social propriety, but to the entire structure of medieval society itself. Here's part 5 of why medieval festivals were so wild, continuing from where the previous parts left off. But perhaps nowhere was this revolutionary potential more visible than in the actual structure of medieval festivals themselves. These weren't simply chaotic free-for-alls, though they might have appeared that way to outside observers. Instead, they operated according to their own sophisticated logic, their own alternative social contracts that demonstrated just how differently society could be organized. Take the Feast of Fools, celebrated throughout much of medieval Europe during the Christmas season. This wasn't merely drunken revelry, though there was certainly plenty of that. It was a systematic inversion of the entire social order, carried out with theatrical precision that would make modern performance artists weep with envy. During these festivals, the lowest-ranking clerics would elect a mock bishop or pope from among their number. This festival leader would then proceed to conduct elaborate parodies of sacred rituals, delivering sermons that mocked church doctrine, blessing the crowd with sausages instead of holy water, and leading processions where sacred hymns were replaced with bawdy drinking songs. But here's what makes this truly remarkable. These weren't random acts of sacrilege. They were carefully choreographed demonstrations of how power actually worked. When a lowly church janitor was crowned mock pope and began issuing ridiculous edicts that everyone had to follow, The crowd wasn't just laughing at the absurdity, they were learning, perhaps without even realizing it, that papal authority itself was just as arbitrary, just as performative, just as dependent on collective belief and participation. The mock pope would issue proclamations like, "All debts are forgiven," or "The rich must serve the poor for one day." And while these were understood to be temporary jokes, they planted seeds of possibility in people's minds. What if debts really could be forgiven? What if the rich really could be made to serve? What if the entire social hierarchy really was just an elaborate performance that could be rewritten at will? This psychological preparation for revolution was even more explicit in festivals like the Roman Saturnalia, which persisted in various forms throughout the medieval period. During Saturnalia, masters literally served their slaves, taking orders and performing menial tasks, while their former servants lounged in luxury. For a few precious days, everyone got to experience life from the other side of the power dynamic. Slaves learned what it felt like to give orders and have them obeyed. Masters learned what it felt like to be at someone else's mercy. Now imagine you're a medieval serf who has just spent several days ordering your lord around, watching him stumble through tasks you perform effortlessly every day, seeing him sweat and strain and struggle with work he usually takes for granted. When the festival ends and the normal order returns, do you think you're going to view that lord's authority in quite the same way? Do you think his commands will carry the same weight of natural inevitability they once did? This is why these festivals were so much more than simple entertainment. They were training grounds for revolution, places where people could practice imagining and implementing alternative social arrangements. They provided crucial psychological preparation for the possibility that things could be different, that power structures weren't eternal and unchangeable natural laws, but rather human constructions that could be challenged, modified, or completely overthrown. The evidence for this revolutionary training can be found in the actual historical record of medieval uprisings. Time and again, we see that successful revolts followed the same patterns that had been rehearsed during festivals. Leaders emerged who had learned to command during festival role reversals. Organizational structures developed that mirrored the alternative hierarchies practiced during celebrations. Revolutionary rhetoric borrowed heavily from the satirical speeches and mock proclamations that had been refined through years of festival performance. Consider the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, one of the most successful medieval uprisings. The rebels didn't simply explode in random violence. They demonstrated sophisticated organizational capabilities, coordinating simultaneous actions across multiple counties, establishing clear chains of command, and articulating specific political demands. Where did they learn these skills? Many historians point to the elaborate festival traditions that had been practicing exactly these kinds of mass coordination and alternative leadership structures for generations. The revolt's leader, Wat Tyler, wasn't some naturally gifted military genius who emerged from nowhere. He was a man who had spent years participating in festivals where common people practiced taking charge, making speeches, and organizing collective action. The rebels' ability to coordinate complex multi-regional strategies wasn't supernatural. It was the result of decades of festival experiences that had taught them how to communicate across social and geographic boundaries, how to organize large groups of people, and how to sustain collective action over extended periods. Even more tellingly, the rebels' demands weren't just economic grievances about taxes and working conditions. They included sophisticated political concepts about equality, representation, and social justice that had been developed and refined through generations of festival discourse. When Wat Tyler demanded the abolition of serfdom and the establishment of equal rights for all people, he wasn't inventing revolutionary ideology on the spot. He was articulating ideas that had been percolating through festival culture for centuries. This pattern repeated itself throughout medieval Europe. The German Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525 drew heavily on festival traditions of mock trials and alternative justice systems. The Jacquerie Uprising in 14th century France utilized organizational structures that had been practiced during harvest festivals and village celebrations. Even failed revolts often demonstrated tactical sophistication and ideological coherence that could only have come from extensive prior practice. But festivals didn't just prepare people for dramatic armed rebellion. They also fostered the development of more subtle forms of resistance that chipped away at authoritarian power day by day. When people spent their festival time practicing solidarity, mutual aid, and collective decision-making, they carried those skills back into their everyday lives. Village communities that had learned to organize elaborate festivals found it easier to coordinate resistance to excessive taxation or unfair legal judgments. Workers who had practiced collective action during celebrations were better equipped to organize strikes or boycotts when their conditions became intolerable. Perhaps most importantly, festivals created what we might call revolutionary consciousness, a fundamental shift in how people understood their relationship to power and authority. When you've spent time in a community where decisions are made collectively, where resources are shared equitably, where everyone's voice carries equal weight, it becomes much harder to accept that inequality and oppression are natural or inevitable. You've tasted freedom, and that taste doesn't fade easily. This is why medieval authorities found themselves in such a complex position regarding festivals. On one hand, they recognized that these celebrations served as crucial pressure valves, allowing people to release frustrations and tensions that might otherwise explode into immediate violence. Banning festivals entirely risked triggering the very uprisings they were meant to prevent. But on the other hand, permitting festivals meant training their subjects in precisely the skills and consciousness that would enable successful revolution. Some rulers tried to thread this needle by allowing limited, controlled festivals while suppressing the more obviously subversive elements. They might permit drinking and dancing but ban satirical performances. They might allow role reversals within strict boundaries while prohibiting any questioning of fundamental power structures. But these compromises often backfired, creating festivals that were unsatisfying enough to increase rather than decrease social tensions, while still providing enough revolutionary training to make uprisings more likely. Other authorities tried to co-opt festival energy by redirecting it toward approved targets. Instead of mocking local lords, festival participants might be encouraged to satirize foreign enemies or religious minorities. Instead of practicing equality among themselves, they might be organized into elaborate displays of loyalty to the existing order. But these attempts at manipulation often failed as well, because the fundamental dynamics of festival consciousness raising were difficult to control once they were set in motion. The most successful medieval festivals, from the perspective of fostering revolutionary potential, were those that managed to maintain their independence from official control, while avoiding direct confrontation that would trigger immediate suppression. These celebrations operated in a kind of parallel social space, acknowledging the existence of the official order while demonstrating that alternatives were possible. They were revolutionary schools disguised as parties, training centers for social transformation, hidden in plain sight, behind masks of harmless fun. This disguise was often quite literal. Medieval festivals featured extensive use of masks, costumes, and theatrical personas that allowed participants to experiment with different identities and social roles while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. A serf could spend an evening giving orders and making speeches while dressed as a mock king, then return to his regular duties the next day as if nothing had happened. But the psychological and social impact of that experience remained, gradually accumulating with similar experiences until it reached a critical mass that could fuel genuine revolutionary action. The wild nature of medieval festivals, then, wasn't just about releasing individual frustrations or indulging in temporary hedonism. It was about collectively imagining and practicing alternative ways of organizing society. It was about building the skills, relationships, and consciousness necessary for large-scale social transformation. It was about keeping alive the dangerous idea that the world didn't have to be the way it was, that ordinary people had the power to change it, and that such changes were not only possible, but potentially imminent. In this light, the apparent chaos and excess of medieval festivals reveals itself as something far more sophisticated and subversive than mere drunken revelry. These were carefully orchestrated exercises in revolutionary preparation, community-building projects designed to strengthen the bonds between oppressed people while weakening their psychological attachment to oppressive systems. They were laboratories for social experimentation, safe spaces where dangerous ideas could be explored and tested before being implemented in the real world. Understanding this revolutionary dimension of medieval festivals helps explain why they were simultaneously so popular among common people and so troubling to authorities. For the oppressed masses, these celebrations offered not just temporary relief from their hardships, but genuine hope for permanent change. They provided concrete evidence that different social arrangements were possible and practical training in how to achieve them. For the ruling classes, they represented an existential threat disguised as harmless entertainment, a slow-burning fuse that might eventually ignite the powder keg of popular discontent. Based on the provided scripts and your summary, here's part 6 of why medieval festivals were so wild. But while these festivals served as pressure valves for social tensions, they inadvertently created something far more dangerous for the ruling classes. In the act of pretending to rebel, peasants began to truly understand what rebellion could look like. The theatrical became the tactical, the festive became the foundational. Take the Feast of Fools, celebrated throughout medieval Europe each December. For one precious day, the lowest members of society would dress as bishops and abbots, mock the sacred rituals of the church, and parade through streets in a carnival of inverted authority. What began as sanctioned satire slowly evolved into something more subversive. Peasants who had spent a day ordering around mock nobles began to question why those nobles deserved their obedience the other 364 days of the year. The Festival of Charivari presents perhaps the most striking example of this transformation. Originally designed to police social norms through public humiliation, these raucous processions gradually became vehicles for expressing genuine grievances against authority figures. When a corrupt tax collector married, the community might organize a charivari that started as mockery, but ended as a very real expression of their anger at his exploitation. In the German territories, the annual carnival celebrations became increasingly political as the medieval period progressed. What had once been simple role reversals between masters and servants evolved into elaborate performances that directly criticized specific nobles, church officials, and royal policies. The masks and costumes that were meant to provide anonymity for harmless fun instead became shields behind which real dissent could flourish. The most telling evidence of festivals' revolutionary potential lies in how quickly authorities moved to suppress them when they grew too bold. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was preceded by years of increasingly radical May Day celebrations, where peasants practiced organizing themselves into large groups, developed systems for rapid communication across villages, and experimented with collective decision-making. When the revolt finally erupted, rebels already possessed the organizational skills they had honed during years of festival planning. French authorities became so concerned about the seditious potential of village festivals that they began stationing armed guards at celebrations and requiring advance approval of all performances and speeches. What they had discovered, too late, was that festivals had become schools for revolution, teaching peasants not just to imagine a different world, but to believe they could create one. The irony was profound. Medieval festivals, designed by the powerful to prevent revolution, had instead become the very mechanism by which revolution became possible. In learning to play at rebellion, The masses had learned to rebel in earnest. The carnival masks would eventually come off, but the lessons in collective action, social organization, and the intoxicating possibility of a world turned upside down would endure long after the last festival song had faded into the medieval night. Through laughter and mockery, through song and dance, through the simple act of imagining themselves as something more than serfs and peasants, medieval people had discovered the most dangerous truth of all, that the world they lived in was not the only world possible. And once that revelation took hold, no amount of force or tradition could completely contain it. Medieval festivals were so wild, understanding the chaos and catharsis. Medieval festivals weren't just celebrations, they were psychological pressure valves that revealed the raw desperation simmering beneath feudal society. While peasants toiled under crushing oppression for most of the year, these wild gatherings offered something far more dangerous than mere entertainment. They provided a taste of what life could be like without lords, without rigid hierarchies, without the suffocating weight of social control. The transformation was immediate and intoxicating. During festivals like the Feast of Fools or Carnival, the entire social order flipped upside down. Servants mocked their masters openly, peasants wore the clothing of nobles, and the powerless suddenly held the reins. In the French town of Sens, the Feast of Fools saw lowly clerks and choir boys elect their own mock bishop, who would then parade through the cathedral in full regalia, while the real clergy sat in the pews like common worshippers. The new bishop would deliver sermons filled with bawdy jokes and social commentary that would normally result in excommunication or worse. But this wasn't just harmless role-playing. These festivals created what anthropologists call liminal space, a dangerous zone where normal rules ceased to exist and new possibilities emerged. When a serf spent 3 days being treated as nobility, when a peasant woman commanded respect typically reserved for ladies of the court, when the poorest laborers feasted on foods they'd never taste otherwise, something fundamental shifted in their understanding of the world. They began to see that their suffering wasn't divinely ordained, it was artificially constructed. The psychological impact was profound. Medieval chroniclers noted how participants would return to their regular lives with a different energy, a restlessness that hadn't existed before. The monk Gerald of Wales wrote about how festival goers would gather in taverns weeks after celebrations, not just to reminisce, but to analyze what they'd experienced. They'd compare their brief taste of power with their daily reality of submission, and the contrast was stark enough to plant seeds of revolutionary thinking. Consider the elaborate mock trials that became centerpieces of many festivals. Peasants would put their lords on trial for crimes like excessive taxation, cruelty, or hoarding grain during famines. While framed as entertainment, these trials followed real legal procedures and often resulted in surprisingly detailed indictments of actual abuses. They learned that collective action provided protection. A single peasant mocking a lord would face the gallows. 1,000 peasants doing the same created an unstoppable force that even the most tyrannical ruler hesitated to confront. The festivals also served as massive intelligence-gathering operations. Information flowed freely during these events. Peasants from different regions shared stories of successful resistance, reports of sympathetic clergy, news of nobles' vulnerabilities, and accounts of uprisings in distant lands. This intelligence network was crucial for coordinating larger revolutionary movements. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 succeeded initially because festival networks had already established communication channels between communities across England. Medieval authorities understood this danger perfectly, which is why they constantly attempted to regulate, control, or ban these festivals. Church leaders condemned them as occasions of sin. Nobles tried to limit their duration and scope. Royal decrees attempted to prohibit certain activities or gatherings. But their efforts largely failed because the festivals had become too deeply embedded in medieval culture, too essential to community survival, and too powerful as pressure valves for social tension. The festival tradition of choosing temporary leaders also provided invaluable training in democratic governance. During many celebrations, communities elected mock mayors, joke bishops, or festival kings who wielded real authority over the proceedings. These temporary leaders made decisions about entertainment, resolved disputes, allocated resources, and coordinated activities. For medieval peasants who lived under absolute monarchy and feudal hierarchy, this was their only experience of participatory government. These mock elections weren't frivolous entertainment. They were serious exercises in collective decision-making that taught communities how to organize themselves without traditional authority structures. Participants learned to debate, negotiate, compromise, and build consensus. They discovered that effective leadership could emerge from their own ranks rather than being imposed from above. When real revolutionary moments arrived, these communities already possessed the organizational skills and leadership experience necessary for sustained resistance. The economic aspects of medieval festivals also challenged fundamental assumptions about property and wealth distribution. During these celebrations, normal economic rules were suspended. Wealthy merchants were expected to provide free food and drink. Lords opened their storehouses to feed the masses. Money changed hands freely, debts were forgiven, and resources were shared communally. This temporary redistribution of wealth gave peasants a tantalizing glimpse of a more equitable society. More importantly, these festivals demonstrated that alternative economic arrangements were possible. Communities discovered they could organize production, distribution, and consumption without the rigid hierarchies that normally governed medieval commerce. They learned to pool resources, coordinate labor, and share benefits in ways that challenged the fundamental premises of feudalism. When revolutionary movements later proposed radical changes to property relations, these ideas didn't seem impossible because festival experiences had already proven their viability. The religious dimensions of these festivals were equally subversive, despite their apparent orthodoxy. Many celebrations incorporated elements of folk religion, ancient traditions, and pre-Christian beliefs that existed in tension with official church doctrine. This religious syncretism taught communities that spiritual authority was not monolithic, that alternative interpretations of divine will were possible, and that the church's monopoly on religious truth could be challenged. Festival rituals often inverted traditional religious hierarchies. Peasants dressed as bishops, conducted mock masses, and delivered satirical sermons that exposed clerical corruption and hypocrisy. These performances weren't mere entertainment. They were theological critiques that undermined the church's claims to moral authority. When later reform movements challenged church power, they built upon ideas and arguments that had been rehearsed for generations during festival celebrations. The artistic and cultural elements of medieval festivals also played crucial revolutionary roles. Songs, stories, plays, and performances created shared narratives that challenged official versions of history and social order. These cultural productions preserved memories of past resistances, celebrated folk heroes who had defied authority, and imagined futures where justice prevailed over oppression. Festival art was inherently democratic because it emerged from and spoke to common experience rather than elite sensibilities. Unlike court literature or church art, which reinforced existing power structures, festival culture gave voice to popular aspirations and grievances. This cultural tradition provided revolutionary movements with powerful symbols, compelling narratives, and emotional frameworks that could mobilize mass support. The sheer scale and duration of medieval festivals also served important strategic purposes. These weren't brief, contained events but extended celebrations that could last for days or even weeks. During this time, normal social and economic activity was suspended, creating space for alternative forms of organization to emerge and solidify. Communities had time to experiment with new leadership structures, practice collective decision-making, and build the social bonds necessary for sustained resistance. The international character of many festivals also facilitated the spread of revolutionary ideas across political boundaries. Pilgrimage festivals, trade fairs, and religious celebrations brought together people from different regions, kingdoms, and social classes. These gatherings served as conferences where resistance strategies were shared, alliances were formed, and coordinated actions were planned. The medieval festival circuit created a continental network that could rapidly disseminate revolutionary ideas and coordinate multi-regional uprisings. Perhaps most importantly, medieval festivals created what we might call revolutionary imagination. They showed communities that the world could be organized differently, that authority could be challenged, that hierarchy could be inverted, and that collective action could achieve seemingly impossible goals. This imaginative capacity was essential for revolutionary movements because it allowed people to envision alternatives to existing conditions and believe that change was possible. Without this festival-generated revolutionary imagination, medieval peasants might have remained trapped in cycles of resignation and despair. The festivals provided psychological proof that transformation was possible, that the powerful could be brought low, and that the meek could indeed inherit the earth. When real revolutionary opportunities arose, communities possessed not only the practical skills and organizational capacity necessary for resistance, but also the imaginative framework necessary to envision and fight for a better world. The legacy of these medieval festivals extended far beyond their immediate historical context. The traditions, practices, and ideas they fostered influenced later democratic movements, revolutionary struggles, and social transformations. From the English Civil War to the French Revolution to modern liberation movements, we can trace the influence of festival-generated ideas about popular sovereignty, collective action, and social transformation. Understanding this hidden history of medieval festivals reveals that what appeared to be chaotic, frivolous celebrations were actually sophisticated schools for revolution. They taught oppressed communities the skills, strategies, and mindset necessary for challenging entrenched power structures. They demonstrated that ordinary people possess the capacity for self-governance, collective action, and social transformation. And they proved that even the most rigid hierarchies could be shaken by the combined force of popular imagination, organizational skill, and collective courage. The wild nature of these festivals wasn't a bug in the medieval system. It was a feature that made revolutionary change possible. By providing regular opportunities for communities to experience alternative forms of social organization, these celebrations ensured that the seeds of transformation were constantly being planted, nurtured, and prepared to bloom when historical conditions became favorable for revolutionary action. Here is part 10 of the 12-part script for why medieval festivals were so wild. As we've seen, medieval festivals served as powerful catalysts for social transformation, but the mechanisms by which these celebrations fostered resistance and revolution ran far deeper than mere temporary role reversals. These gatherings functioned as sophisticated schools of insurrection, where the oppressed learned the practical skills and ideological frameworks necessary to challenge their overlords in the real world. Consider the Feast of Fools, that notorious December celebration where the lowest clergy assumed the highest offices in mock ceremonies that scandalized church authorities for centuries. What appeared to be simple, blasphemous entertainment was actually a masterclass in organizational structure and alternative governance. When a lowly deacon donned the bishop's mitre and delivered sermons mocking church doctrine, he wasn't just providing comic relief for his fellow celebrants. He was demonstrating that ecclesiastical authority was nothing more than costume and ceremony, that the supposedly divine hierarchy of the church could be dismantled and reconstructed by ordinary people with extraordinary audacity. These mock bishops learned to command attention, to organize elaborate processions, to delegate responsibilities to their temporary subordinates. They discovered that the machinery of power was far less mysterious than their superiors claimed. The skills they developed during these festival performances, the confidence they gained in assuming leadership roles, the networks they built among like-minded rebels, all of these elements would prove invaluable when the time came for genuine resistance. The same pattern emerged in secular celebrations like the boy bishop festivals, where children temporarily ruled over adults with all the pomp and circumstance of legitimate authority. These weren't mere games or harmless diversions. They were exercises in imagining and practicing alternative social arrangements. When a 12-year-old boy commanded grown men to kneel before him, when he redistributed wealth from the rich to the poor, when he pardoned criminals and punished nobles for their arrogance, he was learning that power structures were malleable, that authority could be transferred, that the established order was far more fragile than anyone dared to admit. The adults who participated in these reversals were equally transformed by the experience. They learned to take orders from their supposed inferiors, to question the assumptions that kept them subservient, to envision worlds where merit, rather than birth, determined one's station in life. These lessons didn't disappear when the festivals ended. They festered in the collective consciousness, creating a reservoir of revolutionary potential that could be tapped when conditions became desperate enough. Medieval festivals also served as training grounds for the kind of collective action that would be essential for successful uprisings. The elaborate coordination required to stage these massive celebrations taught participants how to organize large groups of people around shared goals. They learned to pool resources, to assign roles based on individual strengths, to maintain secrecy when necessary, and to present a unified front against authority figures who tried to suppress their activities. The charivari, those raucous nocturnal processions where communities would publicly shame individuals who violated social norms, provided particularly valuable lessons in mob psychology and crowd control. Participants learned how to channel collective anger into focused action, how to use noise and spectacle to intimidate their targets, how to maintain group cohesion even in the face of official retaliation. These skills would prove directly transferable to the peasant revolts that periodically erupted across medieval Europe. But perhaps most importantly, medieval festivals fostered the development of what we might call revolutionary consciousness, a shared understanding that the existing social order was neither natural nor inevitable. Through satirical performances, mocking songs, and symbolic inversions, these celebrations created space for people to articulate their grievances and imagine alternatives to their current circumstances. The carnival plays performed during Shrovetide were particularly subversive in this regard. These dramatic performances often featured plots where peasants outwitted nobles, where the poor triumphed over the rich, where traditional hierarchies were not just inverted, but completely destroyed. Audiences didn't just passively consume these fantasies, they internalized them, carrying these visions of justice and liberation back to their daily lives, where they served as inspiration for real-world resistance. The songs and chants that emerged from these festivals were equally revolutionary in their implications. These weren't abstract theological debates or scholarly treatises on political theory. They were simple, memorable verses that ordinary people could learn and repeat, spreading radical ideas through networks of oral tradition that were impossible for authorities to monitor or control. A ditty about a greedy lord getting his comeuppance might seem harmless enough, but when sung by thousands of voices across multiple villages, it became a form of ideological warfare. Medieval festivals also provided crucial opportunities for different communities to share information and coordinate resistance efforts. The traveling performers who moved from celebration to celebration carried more than just entertainment. They served as informal news networks, spreading word of successful uprisings, failed rebellions, new tactics for resisting authority, and emerging leaders who might be worth following. A juggler who had witnessed a peasant revolt in one region could share tactical knowledge with potential rebels in another, creating connections that transcended local boundaries. The timing of many medieval festivals coincided with periods of economic hardship and social tension, making them natural flashpoints for revolutionary activity. Harvest festivals brought together people who had just endured months of backbreaking labor for minimal compensation. Religious celebrations gathered communities that were already questioning the gap between church teachings about charity and the actual behavior of ecclesiastical authorities. These weren't coincidences. Festival organizers, whether consciously or unconsciously, understood that celebrations could serve as cover for more serious political activities. The anarchic atmosphere of these events made them ideal venues for recruiting potential revolutionaries and testing their commitment to radical change. Someone who was willing to mock a lord during a festival might be persuaded to join a more serious conspiracy against that same lord. Someone who enjoyed redistributing wealth during a carnival might be ready to participate in actual property seizures when the opportunity arose. Medieval authorities understood the revolutionary potential of these celebrations, which explains their persistent efforts to regulate, control, or suppress them entirely. Church officials regularly issued edicts against the Feast of Fools. Secular rulers tried to limit the scope of carnival activities, and local magistrates attempted to monitor festival gatherings for signs of seditious behavior. But their very efforts to contain these celebrations only confirmed their power and importance. The cat-and-mouse game between festival organizers and authorities created its own form of resistance training. Celebrants learned to operate in grey areas of legality, to use coded language and symbolic gestures to communicate dangerous ideas, to maintain plausible deniability when questioned by suspicious officials. These skills in subterfuge and misdirection would prove invaluable during actual revolutionary movements. The legacy of medieval festivals as schools of revolution can be traced through the major peasant uprisings that erupted across Europe during the 14th and 15th centuries. The English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the Jacquerie in France, the German Peasants' War of 1524. All of these movements drew on organizational models, rhetorical strategies, and ideological frameworks that had been developed and refined during centuries of festival celebrations. When Wat Tyler led his followers to London in 1381, he wasn't inventing revolutionary tactics from scratch. He was drawing on a rich tradition of collective action that had been honed during countless May Day celebrations, harvest festivals, and religious processions. The rebels' ability to coordinate their movements across multiple counties, their skill in using symbolic gestures to communicate their demands, their understanding of how to present themselves as legitimate representatives of popular will. All of these capabilities had been developed during decades of festival participation. The revolutionary potential of medieval festivals extended beyond their immediate participants to influence broader patterns of social change. The ideas and practices that emerged from these celebrations spread through networks of kinship, trade, and religious affiliation, creating cultural currents that would eventually reshape European society. The emphasis on equality and justice that characterized many festival traditions helped lay the groundwork for later democratic movements, while the critique of arbitrary authority that these celebrations embodied would eventually contribute to the development of constitutional government and individual rights. Even the aesthetic dimensions of medieval festivals served revolutionary purposes. The elaborate costumes, masks, and decorations that characterized these events weren't just entertainment. They were tools for exploring identity and challenging social categories. When a peasant donned the robes of a king, when a woman dressed as a man, when a fool proclaimed himself a sage, they were experimenting with the idea that social roles were performances rather than natural facts. This understanding would prove crucial for later movements that sought to expand opportunities for social mobility and challenge traditional hierarchies. The communal nature of festival preparation also fostered the kind of solidarity and mutual aid that would be essential for successful resistance movements. The months of planning that went into major celebrations required unprecedented levels of cooperation between individuals who might otherwise compete for scarce resources. Peasants learned to share tools and materials, artisans collaborated on elaborate projects, and entire communities pooled their resources to create spectacular displays. These experiences of collective achievement demonstrated that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they worked together toward common goals. Medieval festivals thus served as far more than temporary escapes from the grinding realities of daily life. They were laboratories for social experimentation, training grounds for revolutionary activity, and incubators for the ideas and practices that would eventually transform European society. Through their careful cultivation of alternative values, their systematic inversion of traditional hierarchies, and their creation of spaces for collective action and mutual aid, these celebrations helped prepare the ground for the social movements that would ultimately bring the medieval world to an end. The wild and chaotic nature of these festivals wasn't a bug in the system. It was a feature. The apparent disorder masked sophisticated forms of organization and resistance that authorities found difficult to detect or counter. Behind the laughter and revelry lay serious preparation for the revolutionary changes that would reshape the world. Medieval festivals were wild precisely because they were dangerous, because they carried within them the seeds of transformation that would eventually bloom into new forms of social organization based on principles of equality, justice, and human dignity. Based on the script summary and reference materials, here's part 11 of why medieval festivals were so wild. As we delve deeper into the psychological mechanisms that made medieval festivals so transformative, we must examine how these celebrations functioned as sophisticated schools of revolution disguised as harmless entertainment. The seemingly chaotic revelry that characterized these events was actually a carefully orchestrated system of social education that prepared communities for the possibility of genuine uprising. Consider the festival of Carnival in late medieval Venice, where elaborate masks allowed participants to assume entirely different identities for weeks at a time. A lowly dockworker could don the mask of a nobleman and walk freely through the city's most exclusive districts, experiencing firsthand what it felt like to command respect and deference. Meanwhile, actual nobles might disguise themselves as commoners, gaining insight into the daily struggles of their subjects. This wasn't merely playful role reversal. It was a systematic dismantling of the psychological barriers that normally kept social classes rigidly separated. The genius of these festivals lay in their ability to make the impossible seem possible. When a peasant successfully portrayed a king for a day, when a servant gave orders to their master, when the social hierarchy was completely inverted, something profound shifted in the collective consciousness. The artificial nature of social distinctions became glaringly obvious. If someone could convincingly play the role of nobility for a festival, what made actual nobility legitimate beyond accident of birth and accumulated wealth? These revelations were reinforced through the festival's elaborate theatrical performances, which often featured thinly veiled critiques of existing power structures. Mystery plays might depict corrupt judges being dragged to hell, while folk tales celebrated clever peasants outwitting greedy lords. The audience wasn't passive. They participated actively, shouting suggestions, booing villains, and cheering heroes. Through this interactive storytelling, communities developed shared narratives about justice, fairness, and the possibility of change. The mock trials that were a staple of many festivals served as particularly effective training grounds for revolutionary thinking. Communities would stage elaborate proceedings where unpopular authority figures were tried for their crimes against the people. These weren't merely symbolic gestures, they were detailed explorations of legal reasoning, evidence gathering, and collective decision-making. Participants learned to articulate grievances, present arguments, and reach consensus through democratic processes. They practiced the very skills they would need if they ever decided to hold real trials for real oppressors. The economic redistribution that occurred during festivals also served as a powerful demonstration of alternative social arrangements. When wealthy merchants were expected to provide free food and entertainment for the entire community, when nobles opened their storehouses to the poor, when guildmasters shared their finest goods with apprentices, people experienced what a more equitable society might feel like. These weren't abstract political theories. They were lived experiences of abundance and generosity that proved such arrangements were practically possible. The festival's emphasis on collective organization revealed another crucial element of their revolutionary potential. Coordinating elaborate celebrations required extensive planning, resource management, and cooperation across social lines. Communities had to form committees, delegate responsibilities, and work together toward common goals. These organizational skills were directly transferable to political action. A group that could successfully coordinate a week-long festival certainly had the capabilities needed to organize a protest, a boycott, or even an armed uprising. The religious dimensions of these festivals added another layer of revolutionary significance. Many celebrations incorporated millenarian themes, drawing on Christian prophecies about a coming age, when the last would be first and the first would be last. These weren't distant theological concepts. They were immediate promises that the current order was temporary and that divine justice would eventually prevail. The festivals made these prophecies tangible, offering glimpses of what the promised transformation might look like in practice. The development of folk heroes and legendary figures through festival traditions provided communities with powerful symbols of resistance. Robin Hood, Till Eulenspiegel, and countless other trickster figures represented the possibility of challenging authority through wit, courage, and solidarity with the oppressed. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were instruction manuals for resistance, teaching specific tactics and strategies while celebrating the moral legitimacy of fighting against injustice. Perhaps most importantly, the festivals created networks of solidarity that extended far beyond individual communities. Traveling performers, wandering scholars, and itinerant traders carried news, ideas, and inspiration from one celebration to another. A successful uprising in one region could be discussed and analysed at festivals throughout the continent, spreading both practical knowledge and revolutionary fervour. These informal communication networks were far more effective than formal diplomatic channels, creating a kind of underground railroad for radical ideas. The authorities' ambivalent relationship with these festivals reveals their intuitive understanding of this revolutionary potential. While they couldn't simply ban celebrations that were deeply embedded in religious and cultural traditions, they constantly attempted to control and channel their subversive energies. Licensing requirements, official oversight, and the co-optation of festival leadership were all strategies designed to defuse the revolutionary potential of these gatherings. But these control mechanisms were only partially successful. The very nature of festivals as liminal spaces, where normal rules were suspended and extraordinary possibilities emerged, made them resistant to complete domination. Even when authorities managed to suppress the most overtly political elements, the fundamental experience of collective empowerment, social inversion, and imaginative possibility continued to work its transformative magic on participants. The cumulative effect of decades or centuries of festival participation was the creation of communities with deeply ingrained habits of resistance, cooperation, and visionary thinking. When real crises emerged, when harvests failed or wars devastated the countryside, when corrupt officials pushed too far or new taxes became unbearable, these communities were prepared to respond collectively rather than suffering in isolation. The peasant uprisings that periodically convulsed medieval Europe weren't spontaneous explosions of rage. They were the logical culmination of generations of festival-based political education. The organizational skills, the revolutionary consciousness, the networks of solidarity, and the practical experience of alternative social arrangements that festivals provided all came together when historical circumstances made genuine change possible. Understanding medieval festivals as schools of revolution helps explain their persistence despite periodic attempts at suppression. They weren't just harmless entertainment that authorities could afford to tolerate. They were essential institutions for maintaining social stability while simultaneously nurturing the seeds of its transformation. This paradox lies at the heart of why medieval festivals were so wild, so persistent, and ultimately so influential in shaping the trajectory of European civilization. The legacy of these festivals extended far beyond the medieval period. The democratic traditions, the concepts of popular sovereignty, the practices of collective organization, and the imaginative frameworks for social transformation that they fostered would eventually contribute to the great political revolutions of the early modern period. In this sense, every medieval festival was both a celebration of the present moment and a rehearsal for the future that was yet to come. As we've journeyed through the labyrinthine corridors of medieval festival culture, we've witnessed how these seemingly chaotic celebrations served as sophisticated mechanisms of social transformation, psychological release, and political resistance. But perhaps their most profound legacy lies in what they reveal about the human capacity to find joy, meaning, and solidarity even within the most oppressive systems. These festivals were not merely escapes from the harsh realities of medieval life. They were laboratories where alternative possibilities were tested, where new forms of social organization were practiced, and where the seeds of future revolutions were carefully planted and nurtured. When a peasant donned the robes of a mock bishop during the Feast of Fools, they weren't simply playing dress-up. They were experiencing, however briefly, what it felt like to wield authority, to command respect, to be heard and obeyed. This experiential knowledge became a powerful psychological tool, expanding their understanding of what was possible and challenging the seemingly immutable nature of their social position. The theatrical performances that formed the backbone of many festivals served a similar function. When villagers watched passion plays or morality tales, they weren't merely being entertained or educated. They were participating in complex negotiations about power, justice, and social order. These performances provided safe spaces to explore dangerous ideas, to question authority, and to imagine different ways of organizing society. The fact that these plays often featured reversals of fortune, where the lowly were raised up and the mighty brought low, wasn't coincidental. It was a deliberate strategy to help audiences envision and emotionally prepare for social transformation. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval festivals demonstrated the power of collective action and decision-making. During events like harvest celebrations or May Day festivities, entire communities would come together to make decisions about resource allocation, conflict resolution, and community priorities. These weren't simply administrative exercises, they were practical training sessions in democratic governance, teaching participants how to negotiate, compromise, and build consensus. The skills developed during these festival gatherings would prove invaluable during times of crisis, when communities needed to organize resistance movements or coordinate uprisings. The economic dimensions of these festivals were equally significant. The temporary suspension of normal economic relationships, the sharing of food and drink, the redistribution of wealth through gift-giving and charitable acts, the collective ownership of festival resources, provided concrete examples of alternative economic systems. Participants experienced firsthand what it felt like to live in a society where abundance was shared rather than hoarded, where mutual aid replaced competition, where human needs took precedence over profit. These experiences created powerful emotional and psychological foundations for later economic revolts and reform movements. But perhaps the most enduring impact of medieval festivals was their role in building and strengthening social networks. The bonds formed during these celebrations, between different social classes, between urban and rural populations, between members of different guilds or professions, created invisible webs of connection that could be activated during times of crisis. When the Peasants' Revolt erupted in 1381, it spread with remarkable speed and coordination across England, not because of any formal organisational structure, but because of the informal networks that had been built and maintained through decades of festival participation. These festivals also served as crucial spaces for the preservation and transmission of cultural knowledge. The songs, stories, dances and rituals that formed the core of festival celebrations weren't simply entertainment. They were repositories of collective memory, containing within them the history, values, and aspirations of entire communities. Through participation in these cultural practices, individuals were initiated into broader traditions of resistance and solidarity that stretched back generations and would continue long after the specific grievances of their time had been resolved. The psychological functions of these festivals cannot be understated. In a world characterized by grinding poverty, constant threat of violence, and seemingly insurmountable inequality, festivals provided essential mechanisms for maintaining mental and emotional health. The cathartic release of pent-up frustrations, the temporary suspension of social constraints, the opportunity to express creativity and imagination. All of these elements helped individuals cope with the daily stresses of medieval life while simultaneously preparing them for more sustained forms of resistance. The ritualistic aspects of these celebrations were particularly important in this regard. The elaborate ceremonies, symbolic inversions, and sacred dramas that characterized many festivals didn't just entertain participants. They helped them process trauma, work through grief, and find meaning in suffering. These rituals provided frameworks for understanding and responding to injustice, offering both emotional healing and practical guidance for future action. As medieval society gradually transformed into the early modern period, many of these festival traditions were suppressed or co-opted by emerging state and church authorities who recognized their subversive potential. The spontaneous, community-controlled celebrations that had flourished in the medieval period were increasingly replaced by officially sanctioned events designed to reinforce rather than challenge existing power structures. This transition marked a significant loss, not just of cultural traditions, but of the spaces and practices that had allowed ordinary people to imagine and work toward social transformation. Yet the legacy of medieval festivals lived on in various forms. The democratic traditions that emerged in later centuries, the labor movements that fought for workers' rights, the social movements that challenged racial and gender inequality. All of these drew, consciously or unconsciously, on practices and principles that had been developed and refined in medieval festival culture. The techniques of collective decision-making, the strategies for building cross-class alliances, the methods for using culture and performance as tools of resistance. All of these had their roots in the seemingly innocent celebrations that had punctuated the medieval calendar. Understanding this history helps us appreciate the profound political significance of cultural practices that might otherwise seem frivolous or inconsequential. It reminds us that social transformation doesn't only happen through formal political processes or dramatic revolutionary upheavals. It also occurs through the slow, patient work of building alternative communities, practicing new forms of social organization, and expanding collective imagination about what might be possible. Medieval festivals were wild precisely because they had to be, because only in spaces of apparent chaos and disorder could the careful work of social transformation take place without triggering immediate repression. Behind the masks and costumes, beneath the revelry and apparent frivolity, serious business was being conducted. The business of building a more just and equitable world. In recognizing this legacy, We honor not only the ingenuity and courage of our medieval ancestors, but also the ongoing human struggle for dignity, justice, and collective liberation that continues to this day. These celebrations remind us that even in the darkest times, even under the most oppressive conditions, human beings have found ways to resist, to hope, and to work together toward better futures. The medieval festival tradition stands as a testament to the enduring power of collective action, cultural creativity, and shared imagination in the long struggle for human freedom and dignity. If you find comfort in slow, thoughtful stories about the people who came before us, I'd be honored if you subscribed.